Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz, and today we are going to discuss income inequality. Thomas Piketty or Piketty, I'm not really sure how to pronounce it, but he's written about this topic. I remember when I was still incarcerated and I was taking an economics course through their, what the hell are those little things called? Tablets. I took a course and they talked about Piketty. And one of the things they said was his data isn't exactly lining up with the facts. I've wanted to have somebody on for quite some time to discuss this, and now I've got him. Of course, I've lost his information that I had on the screen, so I'll have to pull it up real quickly. But he's a PhD in economics. He's also an economics professor. He's focused on monetary issues. And I'm going to get you a more detailed bio in just a second here. Maybe I'm not. Robert, can you tell us about
Yes,
yourself?
I'm a college professor. I taught for almost 20 years at Western Carolina University in Cullowhee, North Carolina. I'm a native New Yorker. Um, I've taught at Clarkson University. My PhD is from SUNY Binghamton.
All right. Thank you so much. I actually had it on the screen, and then when I hit record, it disappeared. So my fault. So, in reading up on some of the stuff that you've written on income inequality, there were three figures that really stood out to me that are relevant into this discussion. And I'm hoping you can just tell us a little bit about each. They are, and I'm going to butcher the names, but what can you do? Vilfredo Pareto, Simon Kuznets, and the aforementioned Thomas Piketty. So, can you just, starting with Pareto, then Kuznets, then Piketty, tell us a little bit about each one?
Pareto is a very interesting person. He was an Italian engineer and he started studying income distribution, and he just came up with this looking at state statistics that were available at that time. He came up with a distribution that was mostly accurate, and it explained like 90% of the distribution of people's incomes. You'd have a large number of people that are on the low end of this distribution, and it would be kind of a bell curve shape. What he started with was what was called the log normal distribution, which you take a normal distribution, it's centered on zero, but when you take the logarithm, that puts the lower end at zero. So you don't have anybody with an income that's negative, but it goes up, and that accounts for the vast majority of the society. But then the upper distribution, there's just like this marginal tail that never ends. It's like there's no upward limit to people's income. And this best known distribution, this explained about 90% of actual data. But what really puzzled him is the fact that real data shows more rich people than this would predict. So he came up with a completely new distribution, which has a half dozen different names, but in his honor, it's primarily called the stable Paretian distribution, and it's like one of its major applications, not just for income distribution, but is for modeling price changes. And it's like Benoit Mandelbrot went to this distribution. And it's also called the Mandelbrot-Levy distribution for that reason, but it's the same distribution, and it just has a little bit fatter upper tail to account for all these abnormally unexpected large number of rich people in the distribution. All he wanted to do was to have a descriptive measure or a predictable model of what distribution should be like. And he was going, by the data that he had. And it's found to be, still very accurate. Log normal explains 90% of it, but this more, sophisticated stable Paretian distribution explains everything else. Kuznets is a 1950s, 1960s era U.S. economist. He's one of the first Nobel Prize winners. He's very important, economist. He came up with this theory of how income distributions evolve over time, called the Kuznets curve. And he said, coming out of like a feudal society, you'd have very, very extreme income distribution. As the Industrial Revolution occurs, what's going to happen is you have these people that amass even more wealth. They're not necessarily the traditional feudal lords, but now you have them being displaced by this new set of industrial managers that further concentrate wealth because they're generating large amounts of new wealth by building factories and railroads and things like that. However, he said, what we have observed going back to, about 1800, what happens is that these new scientific discoveries that account for the Industrial Revolution, what happens is these get diffused throughout the society. And although, these people are still much, much richer, the managers and owners of the industrial activities, what happens is the extra income gets diffused widely throughout the society as people become industrial workers and mid-level managers, and there become lots and lots of them as the society grows. So what he predicted would happen is that income inequality would rise as you enter into an era of industrial progress, but then it would go down again, and you get a more equal and therefore also richer society at the end of it. And that's been very, very controversial, although there's very strong evidence for it in the data that this does occur. But it depends on what data you look at and how you look at it to find evidence of this. And then, of course, it's also offset by subsequent barrages or instances of technological progress that generate new wealth for different groups of people. Eventually that's going to be diffused as more and more people are hired to work and use this new technical knowledge to make wealth.
So would that be like, hold on one second, I just want to ask, so
Sure.
what you're describing at the end there, because to me that's fascinating, that basically you're talking about creative destruction, right?
Right.
That as certain industries go out of business and are replaced by new ones, sort of the process of industrialization starts over, but in to use like an Austrian term, like in a relative sense, it's not for the whole economy. You're not having an industrial revolution, but in various pockets of the economy, you would have this starting over dynamic that you're discussing. Is that accurate?
Yes, I think to a large extent, when you have an industrial or a technological revolution, it does two things. One is it makes old capital equipment and old scientific expertise, it's never scientifically obsolete, but it can become economically irrelevant. What happens is people are very, very invested in this, and they have these kind of set in their ways expectations. What will happen is that if they're not adaptable enough to a changing society and new entrepreneurial innovation, what will happen is they're going to be left behind because they're too devoted to it's like, well, like Penn Pennsylvania Railroad, we're merging with New York Central. It's going to be the biggest railroad in history. This organization is going to exist for the next 10,000 years. It lasted about 10 years, and that kind of mindset is always vulnerable to economic change. It's like the people that are receptive to that and aware of it are the ones that actually benefit directly from these changes. Everybody, society in general, benefits from them indirectly, though.
Okay, so basically, as society becomes more industrialized, we can expect to see less inequality. In the beginning, you see a lot. Toward the end, we see less and less. Now, Piketty, am I pronouncing it's Piketty, right?
Piketty, yes.
Now, he disagrees with the Kuznets curve, correct? And he says that we're actually getting more and more unequal, right? Is that
Yes,
basically what he
he
says?
says, here's the data that I have for France and the United States and the UK and various other countries. And his measure of income inequality, which he looks at the highest 10% of income earners and the highest 1%. And he says these percentages of the population since about 1970 are controlling more and more uh, of society's wealth. Their income is going up. Therefore, overall income inequality is getting worse from these points in time.
So a few years back, I read, I think it was Intellectuals in Society by Thomas Sowell. And he said one of the issues with the claim that society is becoming more and more unequal economically is that the people making the claim treat statistical categories as if they're actual people. And what he meant by that was, so the people that, say, if you start as your baseline 1980 and say, okay, we have more disparities in income from 1980 till now, is that you're neglecting the fact that they're not the same people, that some of the people that were toward the bottom go toward the top, some to the top, they go to the middle, to the bottom, whatever. Is Sowell accurate in his depiction of the discussion surrounding income inequality?
Actually, that's an excellent point, because just because the upper 10% is acquiring more wealth, that doesn't mean it's the same people. And I'd say in France, it's more likely to be the same people than it is in the United States. But he's not even addressing that question, and it's a very, very relevant question.
There's also the question of generational wealth. So a couple years ago, I had a debate with the senior editor from Mother Jones magazine, Michael Mechanic. He had written an article for Mother Jones all about generational wealth and how people aren't earning their money, then the capital and finances, that gets to stay within the same family. So I agreed to debate him on it. And what I quickly found, what I wanted to address really was the moral arguments he was making. But what he was saying wasn't even true. Like, most millionaires aren't born millionaires. Only when you get to the very upper, to billions, is it even, if I'm not mistaken, it's been a while, but it's like 50-50. So even those claims that it's all generational wealth and wealth stays within certain families was bunk. So, but what I want to talk to you about are a couple of things. So it seems when we're addressing income inequality, there's empirical claims, meaning factual stuff. Is it actually occurring? There's the utilitarian arguments about, is it bad actually, even if it is occurring for the most people? Can it be a good thing? And there's also the moral argument, the people who just say that income inequality is, it's immoral, it's bad. But the first I want to address are the empirical questions. So first, you write that there's two ways to measure income inequality. What are they?
Well, I mean, there's basically looking at the percentiles like Piketty does, and there's also really a more sophisticated um, uh, method that's done. It's basically the same way we would look at market concentration to measure the level of monopoly in a society. You basically take all the income earners or the wealth holders. It depends on whether you're looking at income inequality or wealth inequality, because those are actually two different things. But say we're just looking at income. If everyone's had the same income, you just look up, you graph the number of people on the horizontal axis and the total income on the vertical axis. And you get, if everyone had the same income, as you added each individual, you get an equal increment to, cumulative income up to that point. So you get a 45-degree line, and that's the ideal of perfect equal income distribution. Now, actual income distribution, what you have to do is rank everybody from poorest to richest. And what you get is a curve that comes in low. Below that, it's called the Lorentz curve. And what will happen is it will be bowed underneath this 45-degree line as you start with the poorest people that give you lower increments of income. And when you get toward the end, you'll have these last few rich people that bring up the curve very rapidly because it has to add the two curves, the straight line and the bowed curve under it, the Lorentz curve, they have to meet because once you get to the last individual, you've accounted for every last dollar of income in the society. So, then you use the area under the above the Lorentz curve up to the 45-degree line, and you divide that by the total triangle underneath the 45-degree line, and you get a ratio called the Gini coefficient. So the lower that is, the more equal people's incomes are. The higher it is, the less equal people's incomes are. And the extreme of that would be a society where no one has any income at all except for one person. So what would happen is you'd add in everybody and get zero income until you got the last person up at the end, and they get the whole society's income. So you get just a total you have the whole area underneath the triangle, and that's your numerator. It's equal to your denominator, so you get a Gini coefficient of 1, which means perfect inequality. No one would argue that that would be a good way to distribute income in a society. But I think the real issues about apart from how you measure it is, what's the source of this income? Why is it unequal? And is that necessarily bad?
Well,
I think it's like my perspective is that, well, why do some people earn more income than other people? Is it because they're more productive? Is it because they're providing more value for others, which is basically what should be happening in a perfectly capitalist society? What's also happening, and it enables people to earn income in a more perverse society or a mixed economy, is they're benefiting off of favors from the government or regulatory imperfections that enable them to have you know specific kinds of monopoly power, and then the only people you can buy a particular product from, so they can charge a higher price for it. These are not welfare maximizing, and those are not beneficial. So those kinds of income, it's like the government should just be doing away with them. 9/10 of the debate about income inequality, though, focuses on, look how bad the inequality is, and we have to do something about it. And it's like, for someone who favors state intervention, that's the only, because the only tool they have is a hammer, which is government intervention. Everything looks like a nail that can be fixed with government intervention. So they're looking at a particular symptom of bad government involvement in the economy, and their conclusion is that, well, this is something that has to be fixed, but it has to be done by redistributing income or something like that. Some other kind of government intervention to fix what's, in my view, primarily the result of government intervention in the first place,
previous.
which is bad income inequality that does not result from differences in productivity or differences in societal benefits that different people's products or services are providing. That's what enables them to earn profits in a capitalist society. It's when they have a government conferred monopoly power that enables them to collect some kind of rent from consumers.
So it's the first thing that came into my mind when you talked about perfect inequality, where one person gets everything, was, well, if one person gets all the income, there's nobody for that person to buy from any longer, and then he would soon collapse under his own weight, and that would seem to happen long before it ever got to the one guy or one lady getting all the money, but or all the income. It would be probably a better way to put it. But is it, as a purely factual matter, is it true that in the United States, at least, has inequality gotten significantly wider since the 80s, let's say, or 70s, whatever number they usually started. I think it's the 80s because they usually like to paint Reagan's tax cuts as the starting point.
Yeah. Um, no, and in fact, not significantly. If you go to Piketty's book and you look at the graphs that he provides, the one criticism that applies to most of his data series, and I think by necessity you would have to do this because there's no uniform data series going back to the 1800s, which is when he starts with most of his analysis. So he has, by necessity, he has to cobble together data series from a variety of different sources. Unfortunately, some of these sources are just wildly incompatible, and you just cannot, concatenate them the way that he did. It's just not a valid procedure. It's the best you can do, but it's not valid. So I don't think you should be drawing serious policy conclusions from that. And then the big thing, which is a major smoking gun, which Phil Magnus pointed out to me, is that one of the problems with the data series he uses for the United States and for virtually every other country, but it's particularly, you know, damning to his conclusions for the United States. He documents a certain increase in income inequality, looking at the 10% and 1% income share, which goes up according to his data series. But here's the problem. He's looking at their before tax income. He's not taking out the progressive income tax that these people pay. And when you do that, you find that it's made much, much lower, and basically it becomes insignificant. It's
See,
basically there's a noise level to his graph when you look at after tax income.
I actually think that kind of weighs in his favor. And let me tell you why.
Sure.
And by the way, I love Phil Magnus. I think he's great. He actually has a paper that I just saw posted to X this morning about Piketty or Piketty, whatever. But it seems to me that his argument would then be, meaning Piketty, that yes, inequality is less because of the progressive income tax, because of the government sort of programs. And if you were to implement the type of society that I would like, he would say you wouldn't be able to count on that and you would actually have greater inequality. Now, my retort to him would be wrong. The progressive income tax and the giveaway programs that you're recommending are actually disincentives to work, disincentives to investment, and actually probably make the inequalities greater rather than less. But if we only look at numbers as if they're static equations, then yeah, it would be leading to less inequality. So, am I missing something?
Well, I mean, what he's doing is he's saying that, before people pay taxes, some people have very high incomes. He's ignoring the fact that, well, after you pay taxes, you surrender a bigger share of that income because you've got higher income. So he's just ignoring the fact that we've already wiped out a large part of income inequality in the US simply by having a progressive income tax. Even with the loopholes that we have and the ways that, because they're better incentivized to do that, because they have various ways of sheltering income that result in them paying less. Even when you include that, there's no significant increase in income inequality since in the last 50, 60 years.
So, if we had, I'm going to pivot a little bit now to the utilitarian stuff, right? If we had the society, that type of society, type of economy that I think you and I would both be advocating for, a purely capitalist society without the welfare states, interventions of redistribution, regulations, and all that sort of thing, would we see levels of inequality that would actually be harmful to the people toward the bottom, like we would, for instance, in the case of perfect inequality? Like, would we ever actually approximate or even come close to reaching the point where harm is being done? Or would it be the case that even the people that are on the bottom rungs of the, economic, I hate the word distribution, but I don't have a better one, they would be better off than they would alternatively? In a more equal society, they would actually be worse off than in a less equal society. That's the way that I view it. I'm just curious how you view it.
Well, I mean, Piketty's, his policy conclusion is what we have to do. First off, I've identified this problem, it's measured, and you can't contest whether it exists or not. It's like we have serious income inequality and it's getting worse. Now, the reality is that, well, yes, you can contest it. There's no serious evidence to support his empirical conclusion. All right. Then his policy, and I mean, because it depends on his empirical work, the policy conclusion just collapses. But if you accept his empirical work and you accept that income inequality in and of itself is always and everywhere bad, regardless of the cause or source of it, and if you, accept that, we have an imperative that we have to attack this and address it and lessen it, his conclusion is that the policy proposal is to have a very, very steep confiscatory wealth tax, not a tax on income, but a tax on accumulated wealth, because he wants to wipe out these, giant landed estates and giant concentrations of wealth that he thinks support all this, pernicious and harmful concentration of income in the hands of a small number of people. The solution is to take the wealth away from them. Now, they're going to still be fabulously wealthy. They're just not going to be, trillionaires. They're going to be, maybe not billionaires even, but basically what that's going to do is it's going to make these available reservoirs of capital no longer, sitting around seeking their best use in the economy. They're going to be dispersed and redistributed to lower earning people. And I mean, that would make the economy a lot less productive. I think when you look at the welfare to, the lowest 10% and the lowest 1% of income earners, you have to consider, what was their welfare like before the Industrial Revolution? How has it gotten better in the last, 200 years, the last 50 years, even the last 20 years? And it's remarkably better. If you look at any measure of economic welfare, especially in the third world, it's just gotten dramatically better since about 1980. And if you look at it anywhere since 1800, it's like average income, life expectancy, any kind of measure of welfare is just skyrocketed because of that. So I don't think you can argue that these people are worse off because income is distributed less equally, even if it was. Um, so I just think, first off, his policy prescriptions don't find much favor with me, even if they were supported by the data. And then, of course, they're not really supported by the data. You really have to tweak and massage the data, torture it till it confesses to get it to tell a kind of
Yeah.
story that he needs it to,
He
in
actually
order.
wants a global wealth tax.
Yes,
Because he says if it's allowed to be a
yes,
case where some countries have lower
right.
taxes than others, then the businesses are just
Then
going to go
everyone will
there.
flee to, the
Right.
tax
So
haven, and it's like Bermuda will become the wealthiest country in the world because it doesn't participate. So it has to be, you know, it's like the countries that ascribe to this, the humanitarian uh, meaning countries that are progressive and follow his policy advice. They have to basically, exercise moral suasion or perhaps coercion to get everybody else to do the same thing, or it just won't work.
Yeah, and I mean, as bad as a wealth tax is in a disincentive to productivity, just on its face, he would have to, or whoever's in charge of this, has to create this sort of international infrastructure to implement this. I don't know, but I'm not very optimistic about such an organization not abusing its power if they're given the power to tax on a global scale.
Yeah,
Now,
I think there are two issues. How could it actually succeed, assuming, which is how they always, you know, the blanket assumption is that there'll be absolute integrity and zero corruption. But it's like, even if you could assume that, there's no way you can do it. And then the reality is that if you've got people making decisions and imposing their will on especially smaller countries, it's just not gonna, there's no way that's going to not be extraordinarily ugly.
right. Well, it ignores public choice economics, right?
Yeah.
You completely are just taking away what the actual incentives of the people implementing these programs would be. You mentioned how inflation impacts inequality, and I've thought a lot about inflation, and I haven't thought about this specific aspect of it. So I'm curious, if you can explain to us why inflation impacts inequality.
Well, I mean, Piketty is not an inflation advocate, particularly, but it's like anybody who is, or anybody who is, and there's a whole fringe movement of economists called modern monetary theorists that basically say high inflation would be very, very beneficial, and it would help move us to a newer and more progressive and more equal system of economic activity and wealth distribution. The reality is that inflation hits the poorest much harder than it hits the wealthy. I mean, it's like even middle class people have all kinds of things that they can do to minimize the impact of inflation. It's like, once your income goes over a certain threshold, you can put your savings in precious metal. You can buy appreciating assets. If your income is below a certain level, and it's basically, kind of the poverty level, or where you would be paying very, very little or zero income tax. It's like people like that, they're paying very, very regressive sales taxes as significant percentages of their expenditure and their income. Um, I'd say the higher you go up on the income distribution, the less of your total income you consume, but that means the less of your income is accounted for by sales taxes or other consumption or luxury taxes. It hits the poorest much harder. And inflation just what that does is it's basically going to ratchet their real income downward, as it makes everything that they have to buy go up in price.
All right. The last aspect that I want to talk about is the moral case. Now, ideally for me, I would prefer to live in a meritocracy where people get what they earn, and that's the way it goes. Now, I'm still Hayekian enough to understand that that's not always going to be the case. There's no guarantees that in a free market, the best product is always going to win, the hardest worker is always going to win. But I do think in a capitalist society, that's largely the case, that the most productive people are going to benefit the most. Now, we talked about earlier Pareto. Now, I read in a book on leadership, I don't know, 30 years ago, what they called the Pareto principle. Now, I don't even know if this is accurate, but I liked it anyways. And it says that the Pareto principle says that 20% of the people are going to be responsible for 80% of the production, and 80% of the people are responsible for 20% of the production. And in my experience, I obviously haven't quantified it to make sure, to come to exact numbers. that actually is accurate. That most people just don't want to innovate, don't want to take risks, don't want to be productive the way that an entrepreneur would, or a capitalist would. So it would seem to me that just on that basis, if we're going by what people deserve, that you would end up with inequality no matter what, because your hardest workers are going to be rewarded, and they're going to end up with more than the people who aren't working the hardest. Now, that's not going to be popular because people, often don't want to hear it. But what is their moral case? How are they judging that inequality is such an immoral dynamic?
Well, they're starting from the assumption that everybody, should have equal incomes. And I think, it's like, I don't know what the justification is for that. I mean, it's just like it's accepted as a self-evident truth. But the fact is, if you're twice as strong as the guy that works next to you, and you're you know both working as longshoremen, I would expect that the stronger guy would be more productive, and therefore would do a better job of that. It's like everybody should, and this is very important in a capitalist economy. Everybody should be doing the work that they're best specialized for. It's not something that should be assigned to them. It's basically you decide what you want to do and where you want to offer your services. You get a benefit in terms of higher income if it's something that you're productive at. Like, for example, I might like to make money as a musician, but see, I'm tone deaf, and I wouldn't be a very good musician. So I mean, I wouldn't expect to be able, and personally, I wouldn't want to listen to that myself. But just suppose I did. It's like your value in a capitalist society is the value you create for others. Um, you've got this natural incentive to seek out whatever you can do that creates the greatest value for others, and you're free to do something else, but you're not free to escape the price of I mean, my best use of my time is as a college professor. um I could try to do something else, but I wouldn't make as much money doing it, unfortunately. But there might be something that I enjoy more, or I think I would enjoy more. It's like it's not going to get me the same income unless it provides that much value added for somebody else. Um, so I mean, you're going to get this as a consequence of people's diversity in terms of preferences and in terms of skills and abilities. Um, and I mean, it should be up to us what we offer to do for pay, and what products we offer, for sale on the market, what services, etc. Um, and I mean, that's always going to result in some people getting paid more and other people getting paid less. I think income inequality, for someone who advocates, government intervention in the economy, it's like an endless reservoir of justification for new programs to correct this aspect of uh, needed income redistribution, or this program to alleviate this issue, and to have a more progressive income tax and things like that. More redistributive schemes. It's like it could never be exhausted. And one thing that they never want to consider is the source of the income inequality, because someone's creating more value for society, or is it because the society has conferred monopoly power and enables them to collect monopoly rents of some kind that don't create value for anybody? It's like those are the things that we need to go after and remove those kinds of abilities to generate income that don't create value for anybody. It's like it's income that's conferred by the government, not conferred by the market.
Okay, so to sum up, it seems to me that if I'm hearing correctly, and I'm pretty confident I am, that the inequality that actually exists has been greatly exaggerated. That what inequality there is isn't actually harmful to the people at the bottom because they're still better off in a capitalist system. Whatever measures the government takes to try to fix it is likely just to make things worse for everybody. And there's nothing inherently immoral about inequality. Would that be a good summary?
I'd say not, there's nothing bad, immoral about inequality per se. The problem is, what's the source of the inequality? Is if the wealth comes from, competing in a capitalist market, you haven't harmed anybody. Even though Marxian would say, but it's
Oh, God.
exploitative because you're earning profits.
Yeah, they have to
But
completely change
I
what
mean,
language means.
but I mean, it's like no, there's nothing wrong. There's nothing immoral with that as far as I'm concerned. But if it's like the government gives you this right to charge higher prices that you wouldn't get in a market situation, it's like those things need to be eliminated, and those are real sources of uh you know income inequality as well. You need to distinguish between good inequality and good welfare enhancing uh, wealth generation and welfare degrading wealth generation, which only comes from this extraction ability that the government confers through bad either intentionally or unintentionally, sometimes through bad regulation. Biggest example of that would be zoning restrictions that limit the number of housing units in a geographic area. And it's like every town in America has these. Every town in America has a housing shortage. The housing shortage results in housing prices being higher than they would be in a free market. They result in rents being higher than they would be in a free market where you could build more units. So I mean, these are things that everybody experiences and many people benefit from, and they're not generating welfare overall. They're creating they're channeling economic benefits from one person to another, and they are exploitative. It's like the Marxists should be focusing on that, but they want to focus on the big factories that represent, and corporations that to their minds represent capitalism.
Well, they're not very known for being bright, are they? The Marxists. Robert, is there anything that we left out that we should have gotten to that we did not get to in this discussion?
No, I think the real important thing that I would want to bring out is that it's like there's always going to be some inequality, and it's like the question that you have to look at is it generated from someone successfully creating value for others, either through entrepreneurial innovation or through successfully managing a production process, or is it from some kind of genuinely exploitative thing that only comes about through government coercion?
All right, excellent. Now, where can people find you?
I i i live in Richmond, Indiana. um and I currently am in Westbury, New York, taking care of my mom here. um so I'm not always that easy to find.
Well, you can find you at AIER. You write for them, right?
I write for them occasionally. I'm a member of the governance there, and I'm a senior research fellow.
If people Google Robert F. Mulligan, they can find an abundance of articles online that you've written.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
that's that's what I want them to do. I want people to
Okay.
find your articles. I want them to read them. Very good stuff. And I hope to have you on our show, The Capitalist Corner, soon. Robert, thank you so much for taking the
Yes.
time to
Thank
be
you.
with us
Thank you
today.
again. It's been a real pleasure.
For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Till next time.